very much for that find. Let's welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Hello, can I check that I'm audible? Hello? Any confirmation if I can be heard? Okay, that's great. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. The ICJ is a global organ that is an extension of the UN. I think the case on the GAF just ignores the fact and the comparative in this debate on what actually are the realistic implications when the ICJ as an extension of the UN creates an enforcing mechanism that is unilateral. It is something that hasn't done, right? Because if they posit to us that the P5 are so powerful and are the main reason as to why the UN ICJ is unable to have any kind of unilateral enforcing mechanisms, they are the big reason as to why their vetoes hinder a lot of these processes post-trials. I think the comparative they don't want to deal with is why that is within the incentives of the P5 to continue to stay within the ICJ. On the overall case is simple. We're going to prove to you why this is the tipping point for the P5 to leave the ICJ, to leave the UN, and why this hurts funding and why this hurts legitimacy, importantly, and why that should be the outcome in which this debate should be weighed on. The first thing, I'll talk about 3 things in my speech today. The first is why the UN takes a large portion of funding from the P5 necessarily. 2, on why the participation of the P5 necessarily depends on these on the lack of strong enforcing mechanisms of the ICJ. And thirdly is why funding is important and why it's more important than things like creating enforcing mechanisms and why we're willing to trade that off. Let's first talk about the UN and why it takes a large proportion of funding from the P5. I think the first direct incentive here is the context of the pre-UN climate that creates this mechanism to ensure that P5 stay within the UN, right? Because prior to the UN, what OG doesn't get is that there was the League of Nations, and the League of Nations failed precisely because a lot of the P5 just didn't have a say as to how the League of Nations went. Like a lot of the problems the League of Nations can be outlined in a few ways. The first is that the League of Nations obliged a lot of these member states to help unilaterally in the face of aggression, regardless of their own interests, right? But 2, a lot of these P5 and states and member states are needed to find forces against their own interests, precisely because the UN had a lack of standing army at the time. But 3, I think the problems the UN of the LON also collapsed when they needed unanimosity to pass resolutions, and that was just impossible, which is why they introduced the veto. They introduced things like funding as a way to maintain the P5's interests, right? I.e., because you funded us this much, we then have to repay you back in terms of like securing a bunch of your interests within the UNSC. Then I think then the incentives of the context of the UN creates that desire for more benefits towards the P5, and therefore we see a lot of the funding coming from the P5s themselves, right? Like how the US takes up like close to a quarter of funding, and the rest of the P5 took up the other half of funding, right? But 2, I think a lot of the funding comes from P5 also just because of sheer capacity, where they want to see it as like the moral arbiters of justice within the international climate, and therefore they pour this proportion of funding to signal their strength, to signal their soft power within the global climate. Then why does this then create a tipping point in which the participation of P5 is dependent on the ICJ and the restrictions imposed on the ICJ from the start of the inception of UN? The first reason to note here is that there are a lot of historical context that already creates pre-existing tensions with the P5 between the P5 members and the UN and the ICJ, right? We see this in a way like the US hostility within the UN has been repeatedly brought up since 1985 about the issues of how they are unhappy with the proportion of funding that they provide, but the disproportionate amount of voting power that they actually have in these ICJ procedures, in these UN. And this hostility has like pressured the UN in multiple ways throughout history in how the US consistently tries to use funding as a leverage, as an ultimatum with the UN, right? They literally threatened to cut their funding from 25% to 20%. But the second reason as to why the participation is hindered on the fact that there are restrictions to the ICJ is precisely because the increased bipolarity in today's world means that there's a very real sense of insecurity and a very real sense of risk that they are going to be the ones who are being investigated by the ICJ. A lot of these countries, like undoubtedly by all houses in this debate, have a lot of skeletons in their closet, right? And I don't think they are unaware of this, and therefore they have a vested interest to keep the ICJ keep the ICJ numb in terms of the kinds of procedures that they can actually take against their own selves, because whatever that they fund they probably don't consent these like funding to go towards investigating and like imposing sanctions on their own citizens or their own like companies, own companies, for instance. But the third reason is that a lot of times, like the P5, the whole reason why they have the veto in the first place is to give them a voice, to give them a kind of say. And the fact that this becomes an independent jurisdiction, a unilateral jurisdiction that bypasses a lot of the political will of the P5, also then dilutes the whole point of why we have the veto in the first place at the outset of the UN, right? The precedence here is that a lot of these countries have really threatened to pull out at any like soft any kind of like soft reform of the veto and soft suggestions to abolish the veto. I think then the tipping point here that you create when the ICJ now has enforcing mechanisms is you tip the tipping point of political insecurity and the future implications of not having to exercise your veto in a way that protects your own interest. Then I think then, because these countries already rely very heavily on the ICJ to protect their own interests, but also the international community relies on these P5 to continue funding the organization, continue funding these due processes. That's the point at which they're going to pull out, because their funding is going to be used against their own consent, against their own interest. And like literally the League of Nations fell apart because the P5 just saw no interest and no reason at all why they should stay within an organization that doesn't benefit them. And I think the power dynamic here is crucial, right? Because the asymmetry means that a lot of the countries who rely on the ICJ and rely on the UN rely on these P5 more than the P5 relies on this organization, which means that the ultimatum and the threat of pulling out is something that is perpetually breathing down the necks of the ICJ as a whole throughout history. Why is then funding the most important metric in this debate? I think the first piece of weighing is just that the funding is prerequisite to a lot of the outcomes that OG wants to achieve, right? So they want to actually get these countries to be accountable, they actually want to enforce these mechanisms. They first have to prove to us why the due process will start to begin with, right? They have to prove to us why the UN peacekeeping troops that go down in response within these conflict areas are going to be sufficient to begin with. Because if you can't protect these lives on the ground, then we think that the urgency in which you can actually create some kind of like change with the funding that you have is minuscule compared to the speculative benefit they get on the side in enforcing these mechanisms in the first place. But the second thing is that there's already a decreased political will to volunteer their own standing armies, because a lot of countries are already becoming increasingly aware about the economic instability and the risk of pouring more funding and more like manpower within the UN. And so the UN has increased need for them to create a standing army. We see this in like how post Rwanda and Somalia, like a lot of countries just have seen the first-hand experience of what happens to their own foot soldiers when they actually send down. But the second thing is that a lot of funding is required for things outside of peacekeeping, right? Things like humanitarian aid that actually goes towards these areas. So maybe we trade off some enforcement of some penalties, but at least we get the UN ICJ as a functional organ. At least the P5 stay because they have some power, and at least we retain the ICJ's power within things like advisory roles and within arbitration, even if they can't enforce it, because the moral weight of their opinion matters when the ICJ is seen as morally legitimate with all the countries participating. For these reasons,
The deputy judicial.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Hello, can anyone just confirm if I can be heard? Hello? Hello? Oh, okay. Someone give me a thumbs up. I assume all is good. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Acknowledging the influence of the P5 is an important compromise to be made for the ICJ to get resources to do some good. The benefit from OO will be as such. We still get some benefits from some enforced rulings, even if not all. Is this any better?
Sorry, it's very soft. We're just struggling to hear you.
Okay. Just give me a moment. Hello. Is this much better?
Yeah.
Okay. Someone give me a thumbs up. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Acknowledging the influence of the P5 is an important and inevitable compromise to be made for the ICJ to get resources to do some good. The benefit from all will be as such. We still get some benefits from some enforced rulings, even if not all. But beyond that, we still get some benefits from recommendations and investigations, even if it's the case that we don't enforce these rulings. The first thing I want to note is address the worst case scenario. Perhaps it's the case that we're not able to fully do what is ideally the best thing, but we're still able to do a lot of things. For example, even if it's the case that the US vetoed the ceasefire in Gaza, we're still able to condemn Israel for genocidal actions, and that's something that's just been passed. The process by which we got to such a ruling involves investigations, involves like sending officials on the ground, collecting testimonies, collating information. All of these things are things I think are generally quite important. So maybe it's the case that we don't go full all the way and get the best ideal version of the ICJ, but I think at the moment, just because of the fact that there are some influence on the P5, does not mean that we take no initiative whatsoever against some capacity, against self-interest. The reason for this is just basically the reason that OJ gave you. The view of legitimacy is important. The same reasons why they would not leave the UN or the ICJ is likely the reasons why they play ball to some degree. I think the discrepancy of why is it the case that this gap is important is something that OG has yet to answer. The second thing I want to do is quantify the contribution of the P5 to the UN and the ICJ. The US contributes at the moment 25% of funding. China contributes another 15%. Remaining P5 members contribute 5% each, which adds up to 15%. So that's more than half of the funding from the ICJ. What are all of these funding used for? I think they're used for investigations, recommendations, proposals, running, for example, like the infrastructure, paying judges, doing, collecting information, preserving infrastructures, etc. The reason why I think this is still important is that these fundings are likely vital for anything that the ICJ does in terms of enforcement at any corners of the world. And I think OG misses out our nuance, because they say that potentially the P5 will not leave, but our case is not contingent on them leaving. Our case is contingent on them cutting funding. I think it's something that they are very likely to be able to do. So if it's the case that it's hard to justify to the world as to why it's the case that they're leaving, they can justify to their own population why they have to cut back on funding. Things like COVID, things like disruption in the war, things like the fact they have to protect their own citizens are likely things that they are able to push forward, and it's likely to be the case that it's not contested because no other country is donating as much money in the very first place. What that means is that you have to take the trade-off of a potentially much worsely funded ICJ. How will this exit of the P5's support, not the P5 itself, destroy the infrastructure of the ICJ? The first thing is, I think remaining countries are also likely to pull out fund, and the reason for that is because there is a tipping point analysis in trying to get things done in the very first place. Insofar as you see that there's already a large amount of fund already there, then you're much more likely to be able to part with your own fund because you understand that this is a global effort. Additionally, the amount that your money you're going to put in are vital to create some level of resolution. So if it's the case that you are donating a couple more percentage to just make possible peacekeeping missions, then you're likely to do so. But without the 65% bulk in the first place, there's just no reason for you to put money in because the tipping point to create any tangible action is missing. The second is that I think the ICJ becomes a lot less concerned with humanitarian concerns because money buys you influence. So the reason why it's the case that we're investing so much regarding genocide and whatever else is because of the fact that likely some members of the P5 care. The humanitarian concerns and the interests of the Western democratic nations, as OG talked about, are also the reasons why on outside the house, the ICJ is likely to perform some capacity for good. On the comparative, when I guess Brazil and China and India and whatever other countries are trying to fund the ICJ, I'm not quite sure if it's the case that the interests of these nations are likely to drive the ICJ towards the kind of rulings that we want to talk about to preserve human dignity. The last thing I want to note is that the OG's case that there is an alternative courts at the moment, and these alternative courts are bad, likely exacerbate with the departure of the P5, because surely the P5 will use whatever capacity they have to make things nebulous, worse in these alternative courts, which has much less transparency, which has much less representation. So at the moment, perhaps they're trying to play ball and assert their influence here, but at least they're keeping one another in check. And the worst thing is just that we get no ruling whatsoever because of the fact that they still have to respect the legitimacy, and because of the fact that it's their influence is fairly transparent, i.e. you can clearly see that the US vetoed the resolution. But in whatever arbitration courts that you're talking about, I think their influence still applies there because there's still a global power, and it's much harder for us to see these things now, which makes the power dynamic a lot worse. Before I go on, I take one from closing.
So if the ICJ says that we're going to enforce the things we have just decided, and then all of these countries go fuck that, we're leaving, what was the ICJ doing on your side? What was the point?
No, so I'm saying that if it's the case that the ICJ has the capacity to enforce whatever, disregarding the veto, you lose the unique support from these 5 nations, which makes up the bulk of the funding that the ICJ has at the moment to do all the things that they've been doing. Insofar as that's gone, then I think you have to
grapple with a new ICJ with much less capacity to guarantee you all of these benefits. And I'm not quite sure then on the comparative, where does the funding come from? Why is it the case that the ICJ is able to function? So maybe it's the case that they can pass rulings, but like the impacts of your sanctions and your enforcement is likely ineffectual given that you have no capital to do these things. Why then is the alternatives of other countries rising up to replace the P5 unlikely? The first thing is, I think like funding here is obviously created in turn for influence. You cannot just draw the correlation as per like Brazil and China and India is getting richer, therefore they will donate money to the ICJ. And there's a reason why the amount of donation has not been increasing like as they become richer. And the reason for that is because they don't get any level of influence for it, so they don't get to veto anything. So if you go and track back, like if it's the case that veto guarantees you funding, there's something that's likely to be good, there's something that is likely to be necessary. The second is, I think insofar as other countries leave, there's also much less of an incentive for you to encapsulate the space because like there's just no capacity for you to validate the fact that the ICJ is likely to be an effective body to create like justice in the very first place. Let's do up the comparative here. I think on the first level, a lot of the things that they talk about are likely symmetric. So insofar as we don't encounter directly against the interests of the P5, we're still able to create a lot of change. On the second level, unique actions against the P5 might be somewhat difficult, but I think it's the case that we're willing to take the trade-off. The reason for that is because we're still able to take all this money to go and like enforce justice in other states. For example, like the Rohingya conflict in Burma, Philippines and Duterte or whatever the case. Insofar as that's true, I think there's still some capacity for us to do some good here. So I think on the flip side, what they have to prove to us is why is it the case that they're so still extremely effectual in these spaces, given that they don't have the capacity to make to leverage resources to enact sanctions, to investigate, to do investigations, to collect information in the very first place. That is the prerequisite for you to enact any kind of justice. So the capacity for you to enforce ruling is ineffective insofar as you don't fulfill the prerequisite of trying to obtain justice. Whereas on outside the house, even if it's the case that we don't directly get these rulings, the fact that we just open investigation, collect information, all these things are likely to be effective in the first place. For all these reasons, please side with OO.
Thank you very much. Let's welcome the member of government.
Okay. Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll take OO at least once. I'm sorry, OG, but you're wrong about a lot of things. First, you can leave the ICJ without leaving the UN. It's true that the Rome Statute at the time of the League of Nations was every member of the UN. It's true that they all work in the ICJ, but there's no reason at all that you can't leave the court but stay in the UN, which means all of their reasons for how the P5 don't want to lose the power of the UN is just not true. And also the OO stuff about how if the P5 leave the ICJ, they'll stop funding the UN is also not true. So please just take that off your notes. This is just factually bullshit. Second of all, the ICJ does prosecute war crimes, just not by individuals. The ICC is the International Criminal Court, and the ICJ does between states. So the point of the ICJ issue with Israel is that Israel is committing a genocide in Palestine, right? So it's a genocide, which is a war crime by the state, not the people. So this is important because war will be a big part of the CJ extension. So what is a CJ extension? First of all, the ICJ actually is really fucking powerful in the sense that if you leave the ICJ, you look absolutely incompetent. And why? If the ICJ says that they're going to independently implement it, it'll be done in an intelligent way, which allows buy-in to be maintained. But second, OO is wrong because I just want to point this out. If OO gets money, they beat OG at best, but they don't have a benefit because if it's rulings for countries that wouldn't have been vetoed, then there's no difference because they don't leave. If it's rulings for countries that would have been vetoed, then the only thing that happens is the ICJ makes a statement about what is right, which it can do on our side, because the Rome Statute allows you to sue countries even if the other country isn't a part of the Rome Statute. You can still sue them as long as you were affected. So I can sue a country that has left the fucking ICJ. Like the US can leave, the US can be sued, the US can refuse to give a fuck, but there can be a conclusion about it. So the statement from the ICJ doesn't really change. We think that if the ICJ can't implement jack shit, then I think it's kind of pointless for them to have all that money for investigation anyway. So we think the point is either the ICJ succeeds or it completely fails and we get a better alternative. First, the ICJ will almost certainly succeed. First, there are so many reasons the P5 will stay. The first most obvious reason is the ICJ is strategic in the cases it accepts, and it doesn't post for extreme cases that are obviously going to push them out of the place. So for example, right now the US is quite divided on Israel-Palestine, which is why it's not actually possible for Biden or Trump to just be like, fuck it, we're leaving the ICJ, because the next person will probably join it back, because it shows that they are much more likely to support the idea of Israel-Palestine genocide being bad, which is because the ICJ recognizes this is something that is politically feasible. It would take the case up. What would it not take up? It wouldn't take up the case against the US conducting like a bunch of terrorist attacks in like Afghanistan, because the only way the US can respond is to back out. They wouldn't be able to do anything about that because the ICJ recognizes the case wouldn't be put into power. Note there are very subtle and simple ways judges can reject cases, like making procedural decisions on what is or isn't okay, or for example pointing out that their jurisdiction doesn't extend to a certain level, or for example that they have a backlog of cases. And often the prosecutor picks these cases politically anyway, because otherwise they wouldn't have any funding and importance to then make the decision and then get anything implemented on either side of this debate. And anything here means like just even the publishing of that transcript wouldn't be popular if people don't think that they want to support it. Also, they can take away funding on both sides, so they already do this carefully. Second of all, there's so many reasons that people don't want to work with you if you leave the ICJ. First, you just admitted you're committing war crimes if that's what the ICJ said, right? Because if the ICJ said the US committed war crimes in X country, and now the US goes like, fuck you, you're wrong, we're leaving because you're wrong. But the thing is that most people know that the ICJ is unbiased because they were members of it. And for decades, everyone in the ICJ obviously had huge control over how the judges worked and the systems and the outcomes occurred. At that point, presumably, it looks like the US did commit the war crime, and it's really fucking scary now to let their army work with you or put their military bases close by to you. But second, also they can't trust you economically. OG says there's other things here civilian-wise, but that's the mech, which is that you can't trust any deals they make with you. They steal your IP, or for example, they forget the sanctions that they were supposed to remove, or for example, they continue putting customs duties on your products. And this is important not because the country that got harmed, that country knows it. Every other country is told this. The reason the ICJ can't, third of all, people find legitimacy in other courts. So if the ICJ does make a ruling, then you leave that court, then you can't use the same level of ruling in other things like say the WTO or the multilateral organizations. So for example, if you don't have an economic ruling in the ICJ right now, you can't do anything else because the WTO doesn't have an appellate court right now. So often there's no actual legal mechanism for lots of civil disputes that OG talks about, which is the incentive for you to keep staying. But fourth of all, the court tells you that they're not a team player, right? It's a big sign that this person doesn't give a shit about their allies and won't continue to support you, and their support is actually fickle, because of the point where they can give up some random person because, you know, they basically broke a treaty with them, they promised them something and they didn't do it. It tells them that this is an individual actor who isn't trustworthy and hence should not be worked with. This is important because there are multiple superpowers in the world and they all want to look competent. This means that right now, first, conflict is rising, so countries want to have people they trust. Second, trade is needed for them, which means that often they need to make sure that they work with people who they can continuously work with and not like have their random trade going away, because, you know, recessions, they desperately need that trade. Third of all, loans are needed, so they need to develop their economy because, you know, again, recession, COVID fucked you over, we had lots of protection, etc. And fourth of all, it's also really important to gain allies because the world is splitting apart, right? Like Russia is being sanctioned, then China is being sanctioned, and so you have to pick a side. At that point, you have to constantly be pushing for your global power as a country. And so it's just not worth it for you as the US, for example, to just back out of the ICJ and make yourself look highly incompetent. Let's say you did back out. It literally doesn't matter, right? Because the first thing is, if one member backs out, then there's a huge incentive for every other member to then stay and make it more legitimate. Why does that work? Before that, opening opposition.
So all the reasons here are why the US won't back out. But our win con is just proving to you that they are less incentivized to fund in the first place. Worst case, back out. So actually,
we win on the rebuttal alone because the impact if we win is incredible, right? Because first, it stops things like actual war crimes in places where the US is willing to do it strategically now. Because now that you've told these countries they have to sanction them or fine them or they'll remove them if they don't, then there's some actual tangible effect on the country which incentivizes it to stop. While on the other hand, the veto is used extremely liberally, as everyone on top half agrees, which means that there is some gray area here. There are places where the US would not have used the veto if it didn't have the power, but also wouldn't have left the court. And you might not know them, but the court definitely will find them. These are countries in the middle of their alliances. This looks like Saudi and UAE having an alliance in Yemen, being put in the ICJ and then being pushed for crimes against humanity and stopped, right? That's the point. So these are tiny things, not tiny things, they're huge things in the middle that we can stop by creating an incentive to not do it by harming you when you do. But yeah, the alternative is great, because if the P5 leave, then you go to regional courts and you don't trust the ICJ anymore, which is amazing. Because note that if you are a victim of the ICJ and then you push for making sure that you win the case, you are spending a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of political will, which has just been resulted in nothing. Nothing happened. No P5 did anything. That is what stops you from funding the ICJ. That's what stops you from giving a fuck about it at all, which means that people don't think of the ICJ as a tool of justice, but as a tool of the P5. That's bad, because that means the investigations aren't allowed. Countries can just refuse to get the investigations in. They can refuse to charge anyone with anything because they don't give a fuck about the court system, which means it serves no meaningful purpose at all. So there's no benefit if they leave, but sorry, there's no benefit if OO gets their money. There's just a harm. And if you leave, that's also a good thing, because we stop trusting a bad court. On that, CG.
Thank you very much. Let's welcome the member.
Okay. Oh, this is gonna be a funny one. This is gonna be a very funny one. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Just give me a second. Give me a second. I will do some performance in my speech. You have to do it justice. In order to illustrate my point, I'm going to now make you imagine what the opening government world will look like. Here is a projected 2025 or 26 Donald Trump speech that talks about the ICJ. They're wrong. They're stupid. I'm going to stop their money. We're going to do all of these things. This is the problem that we're talking about in this debate. The difference between ICC and ICJ is trivial to the extent in which they're both dependent on state enforcement. ICJ settles problems between countries, but they can do a lot of things, such as, for example, right now rule whether Israel is committing genocide, as raised by South Africa. You can fine countries during this particular idea of a motion. You can recommend sanctions to states, but the states need to actually enforce the payment of these fines, and states also need to do the actual sanctions. So in many of the cases, anything that you really do in this particular case is dependent on the states. If states don't want to do it, or if politicians are not pressured to do these particular things, they're not gonna do them anyway, and there wouldn't be any significant impact. So the core way that the ICJ and these international institutions actually have an impact in our world, and I agree with closing government that they do have a significant impact, is through perception. Their credibility is held in people's eyes. They're quoted by the media, journalists, activists, academics, historians. This means that problematic actors who currently have incentives to discredit and heavily scrutinize international law, ICJ, and all of these particular institutions and these specific institutions are now going to be even further empowered to do so with specific examples, with specific things that have happened. They're going to be able to point them out and say, this institution is illegitimate. Anything that they say does not matter. And there is a nuance here, because I want to engage with opening government, who there is this whole notion of credibility that is held into these particular cases. But this notion of credibility can be nuanced. You can still be in the UN. you can say and claim that you're working towards peace, but you can distance yourself from the ICJ rulings in particular if the perception in your country is that the ICJ is necessarily bad or biased or whatever. I'm later going to visualize and explain how this is likely to look like. But what I need you to understand is that these countries heavily rely on that perception of credibility, and this perception can be destroyed and will be much easily destroyed by problematic actors if we allow them these particular things. I also want to say that is not the fact that we don't care about multiple countries buying into this stage. Like saying stuff such as China and Russia can go, we don't care about them because the US will stay, is extremely problematic because it further legitimizes these institutions. Even if one leaves, this can be the end be it all. But second of all, I really don't think that this is a great example because besties, I wouldn't really put the US on a pedestal when it comes to upholding to international law, when it comes to not fucking up many places in the world, when it comes to, I don't know, doing the right thing in Palestine currently in these particular places. So I really want to think about the implications of the things that you're saying and the even if analysis that you're making in this particular debate. Why? This is what I need to explain to you in order to win this debate. Why currently ICJ is being already scrutinized, how it's going to be scrutinized further by this motion, and then why this further scrutinization is going to be significant to the extent in which it leads to the delegitimizing of these institutions, and thus anything that it can do already for the world will be extremely, extremely limited. If it can even exist in the long term, will be unclear. The now. There is nationalist rhetorics in countries, constitutionalist movements, US, UK Supreme Courts in the world, essentially, that are already having incentives to make sure that basically there is distinction between national law and international law, and that countries can do whatever they say and they can settle disputes only within themselves. So there is an incentives from the highest already institutions to discredit these particular institutions in some cases because a lot of people believe in these particular things. The second thing that's important is there's already nationalist and populist parties not only in the West, but all over the world, who for different reasons have incentives to co-opt these narratives already. They might be saying the West is whitewashing you, they're meddling in our affairs if you're the US, they question your legitimacy in many of particular things. They talk about this stuff. The third thing that is happening right now is that there are structural biases within the ICJ that are being called out by different things, including academics. Here's 4 of them, for example. Judges favor states that appoint them. Shocker. Second, judges favor states whose wealth level is close to that of their own state. Shocker. Judges favor states whose political system is similar to that of their own states. Another shocker. And fourthly, judges sometimes favor states whose culture, language, or religion is similar to that of their own states. Another big shocker in this particular debate. All of these biases that people can point out to. You can single out the ICJ as ineffective. The more you discredit, the less it will hurt your reputation if they are against you. This means that all of the people who are already using the ICJ to legitimize their opinions, such as political activists, journalists, are even having less of a voice. The new narratives, they do what they want. We don't care about them. We don't care about what the UN thinks. We don't care about activists. We don't care about these institutions because they're biased. They have different incentives that are out of our own way. All of these things means that all of the good things that people in this debate agree the ICJ is currently doing will be further delegitimized, and people and institutions, governments, politicians will now be able to justify their wrongdoings by saying, we don't care. This is bad.
Thank you very much. Let's welcome the government whip. Thank you very much. Let's welcome the opposition whip.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Just a second. Okay, starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. Start. Dear panel, the ICJ is barely holding on, and the only thing that is holding it on is the connection with the Security Council it has. When we separate this, this will be the tipping point for these institutions to be completely discredited and having the formality of its actions. This is the most important impact in the debate, and we're the only ones that prove it. But why is the Security Council so legitimate? Like, can you tell me another place where the big 5 countries in the world work together with diplomacy, with everything like that? This is literally the most legitimate institutions in the world because it has the USA and Russia working together. So it being tied to the court gives extreme legitimacy to the court, and this is what government wants to separate. Let's now begin with opening opposition. I have 2 problems with opening opposition. The first one is that in the case that the ICJ never manages to enforce anything because the P5 never agree. Why do they never agree? Because they have they have competing incentives. They will be seen as weak if they agree with their country that's like seen as their opponent. If they make compromises, they have to protect their proxies that support them in the developing world. In this sort of particular case, they're unlikely to ever agree. Then giving funding to an institution that does nothing seems like a very big waste of money. And this is the first problem that is also pointed out by CG. But the second problem with OA's case is that you can recognize ICJ, but you cannot recognize ICJ, but also be part of the UN, as my first speaker explained. This looks like literally the USA right now that says that the ICJ has no jurisdiction over their land, but still supports the UN and still donates to these organizations. This is something that is factuologically happening currently. They can still manage to give for humanitarian aid to get the good rep to the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Aid, for example, that is a completely independent institution from the ICJ. So at the point at which this is correct, I am uncertain as to how this is not a very much marginal impact of the debate, while we are the unique and only way to give legitimacy to these journalists, to give legitimacy to these advocates, to make victims feel like there is a big institutions that recognize their pain and suffering. So this is why we go over opposition. Now let's begin with opening government. The first argument is on more trust and effectiveness. The problem with this case is that the ICJ has no way to enforce their politics on your side of the house. Let's look at the examples. Fines can't work because there's no one to enforce it. Notice, if I stand and say you owe me 5,000 billion euro, you're unlikely to just say, okay, here you go the money. Somebody has to enforce this. When there is no Security Council, nobody is enforcing this, and they can just screw you, I'm not going to pay this. The second example, we flip why leaving the ICJ is actually a bad thing, so this does not also work. But thirdly, on economic sanctions, they're very symmetric. I guess if a country has a reason to sanction a country, they will do this either way, no matter what the ICJ recommends, because they have incentives to do this. The ICJ is not a tipping point for any of these countries because they have bigger personal incentive for their own economic development or their own good reputation. So the ICJ recommending something will lead to zero impact for pretty much any big country. But okay, what does this all mean? This means even if they pass policies and they pass laws, no one cares to follow them, so they're pretty much useless, making the first argument of opening government symmetric. Now to the second argument about penalties and illegitimate. Notice penalties don't happen, as I've already explained, but the rulings are made by the same experts you talk about on our side as well, because the rulings and them being sent to the Security Council are 2 separate things. So even if we take your best case, these people are very unbiased and get legitimacy. Notice that this is symmetric because these people make the rulings on our side of the house as well. Okay, now there is a very funny thing that happens here is that opening government gives a refutation of how there is incentive to not always use veto power because it will be democratically unpopular. Firstly, this is a backstop to their case, but secondly, I have to refute this to make my points no better. Notice, this is just populist talk. Most people don't even know what veto power is. So do you really think people will do something about it when they say on the news, oh, USA has used veto power? I believe not. But even if they know what it is, they have other priorities like the economy of their state that can be used by the state to justify using veto power, and the people are likely to be okay with this because it's a bigger priority, because it impacts them on a bigger level. Before I continue with CG and POI opening.
The ICJ never solves war crimes because CG concedes they'll be strategic. This is a debate not about war, but China territory, post-colonial reparations that get vetoed.
Yes, of course. Let's say China give me back the territory and they're going to give us back the territory. Please be more realistic in this debate. Okay, let's continue with quasi government. Quasi government say a few things. Firstly, they have one mechanism as to why they won't leave this sort of specific organization, or at least one powerful mechanism, which is you can't leave because it looks like you did what they blame you for. You look incompetent in this way. Notice, how do we refute this? You can spin it in a way in front of your population. Your population likely trusts you more than the ICJ about this because it's literally the first time of them hearing of the ICJ, but also they don't understand how the ICJ works. Like, who elects the people in the ICJ? Why are these specific people going to decide my fate? While I know I have elected the US government. At the point at which this is the case, why do they care for at the point which this is the case? Notice how the government doesn't care living won't lead to bad reputation because the government can spin it in a way that is beneficial for them because people trust them comparatively more than the ICJ. But also, they never explain why do these countries care for reputation so much. This is simply asserted. Notice, they may care, but it's not their most important incentive because eventually people will forget because newer things start to happen. Newer horrible events happen in this way and they're likely to focus on them. But here is the comparative. ICJ is not unique with giving humanitarian aid. If countries want to do this irregardless to raise their reputation, for example, they will do it. Which ICJ is unique as the only institution that gives legitimacy to advocacy. If countries want to give humanitarian aid, they don't need to go through the ICJ. At the point at which this is the case, we're the team that provides the only unique impact in the debate, which is done only on our side of the house. For all of these reasons, vote for us.
Thank you, everyone, for this debate. We will now deliberate. Thank you all.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.